really wanted to have you on to talk about a lot of things. But I first was kind of hoping that we could start by talking a little bit about where you're from, because I think that's a really important part of you, it sounds like. And I'm personally just excited for it because I lived in Tennessee for almost the past 5 years up until recently.
I'm from Salina, Tennessee, which is in Clay County, which is 40 miles north of Cookeville, Tennessee. People are listening that aren't familiar with Tennessee. They may not know where Cookeville is. So that's halfway between Nashville and Knoxville. That's how out of the way Salina is. It's 2.5 hours roughly from any city, actual city. It's like equidistant almost between Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Lexington, Kentucky. I mean, it's like the middle of nowhere as far as Tennessee goes. Very rural, no traffic lights, no McDonald's or Walmarts or anything. I graduated high school with 60 people, and that was the biggest class my school had ever had. It's typically more like, 35 to 45 kids, I think, in a graduating class. So, I mean, it's very small. And that's where I grew up. Then I went to college in Cookeville at Tennessee Tech University.
Okay.
Graduated from there, got a job. It's just the job I happened to get. It's not like I was like going for it specifically, with the U.S. Department of Energy at the Oak Ridge field office up there, where they got all that crazy sciencey shit, and started doing comedy in Knoxville, and then just progressed that way, and then went viral on the internet 5 years ago. Was able to quit that day job, go full time in comedy, and that's the Cliff Notes version of how we got to here. But I can elaborate on any of that you guys want.
No, that was perfect, and I'm glad that you mentioned the going viral thing, because that's actually how I discovered you. And I have to give credit. One of my colleagues when I was working in Nashville, her name was Terry Quillen, was the one that showed me your video. She's a former editor of the Tennessean, actually. And so I remember seeing that back then. And at the time, it was a time where, I moved to Tennessee and was feeling kind of demoralized about the politics of the South. And so It definitely was something that gave me a lot of hope with respect to that. I'm kind of curious, because you live in California now, and I know you talk a lot about Southern stereotypes. I'm kind of curious if you experience that a lot for yourself out there, and maybe if you can elaborate on that, because on this show, we talk a lot about Appalachian stereotypes, which are obviously very similar to Southern stereotypes.
Yeah, I think that I get the impression a lot, sort of like the side eye that I get from people when they hear my accent, you know what I mean, that I'm assuming is related to assumptions they make about me or whatever. But in terms of like actual, verbal exchanges that indicate any of that, the only thing that's happened, and this has happened multiple times out here, and it's usually in the context of like I'm at a comedy show or something, is that people think that I'm faking it. Like they think that it's not like that not that I'm faking being from the South necessarily, or maybe they think that's fake too, but they don't think the accent is real or whatever, which is always funny to me, because it's like, I want people out here to think that I hate math, or whatever. Like that's what I'm going for. But it's just so alien to a lot of people out here that not only are they caught off guard by it, but it's hard for them to compute, I guess. They just don't run into it very often. So they think it's like a shtick or something. And not that I don't, have my own shtick, but like, it's all very real, comes from a very real place. But I think anybody that is from the South and you can tell it, like they sound like they're from the South, is, ran into that sort of thing before, where like people clearly think you're dumb or maybe assume you're racist. Like we did, me and Corey and Drew, the guys I tour with, did a sketch for Comedy Central about being in a bar in New York, and a guy telling us a bunch of racist jokes and stuff, because he just assumes that we'll be down with that, which like that's a real thing that happens. People, you could tell. Oh yeah. People feel like they have carte blanche to just be like openly racist or whatever in your presence, or just assume that you're on the same page with them and being a conservative or something. That has happened to me multiple times out here too, where like I'm thinking to myself, if I didn't have my accent, would you be saying this shit right now like it's an Uber driver or something? And I assume the answer is no, because I feel like they've got to just automatically assume that most of the people they run into are liberal or whatever, then they hear me talk and they're like, oh, this is a guy I can unload on, you know, and then they do. So it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, one thing we had Drew and Corey on the show. You're actually the trifecta
Right
of having
on.
the entire Well Read group on. One thing that we asked them, and I want to get your take on it. Do y'all ever, or do you specifically ever feel like your accent or the ability for somebody to tell you're from the South has ever held you back in comedy or in LA, for instance?
Yeah, I think that, I audition and stuff for roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it, doesn't do me any favors a lot of times in that regard. But I don't get that feedback necessarily. I just assume it because it's hard for me I can put on other accents, mostly cartoonish ones, but like, I'm not saying I'm great at that, but I can fake another type of accent, but it's really hard for me to just speak without my act. Do you know what I mean? Like just a general American accent.
Mm-hmm.
To me, my brain interprets as like the absence of an accent. Yeah. And that's really hard for me to do. So I think I kind of screwed myself over in that way a lot of times. Or also people have this expectation that you're going to be more, I don't know, hillbilly-y or something. Like it's going to be more of a show when you're in a meeting with them or something like that. Which is, maybe partially my fault because in the videos I'm a little bit louder and more abrasive and whatnot. But I mean, that's just sort of how that goes. I used to get told by people that it would hurt, my accent would hurt me like when I still had a day job, like in the business world or applying for jobs or whatever, that it would. And I think I've never been told this, but like I was trying to find jobs in Los Angeles in my day job field just so I could move out here and pay the bills and try to be a comedian out here as opposed to doing it in Knoxville because that's just like what you're supposed to do or whatever. And I never got anywhere at all in looking for jobs out here, even though I was absolutely qualified per my resume. And again, a lot of this is probably just in my head or chip on my shoulder or whatever, but I always thought that, the accent might have had something to do with that. You definitely assume it. And I know that it's a real thing. But it's not like I'm just literally being told by people, the reason this isn't happening or whatever is because of the way you talk. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's hard to say exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate. We heard that from a lot of people. We did an episode on accents where we actually collected a lot of different accents from throughout Appalachia. And one of the common threads that people told us was that they felt like it was holding them back, or they felt like there was some preconceived notions about who you are and what you believe in, like that you're a racist or that you're
definitely
a Republican. It's something that leads me into something different, but I know that you all have talked about it before, especially when you were doing touring prior to the pandemic, is about like the preconceived ideas of red states and like, why would you want to do your business in a state that votes Republican, or why would you want to hold an event or something in a state that votes Republican? It's something that drives John and I up a fucking wall. Because it devalues the people that are doing, I think, the hard work in those states, and it just paints a generalized picture. And I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on that, about just people's assumptions about red states in general, quote unquote red states.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably because I'm, a liberal from a red state, I've always been very opposed to that mentality of like boycotting whole states or whatever. We've been asked before. Corey just got asked literally yesterday. Our first show back on tour after the pandemic is next month, July 10th in Atlanta, Georgia. Go to wellreadcomedy.com for tickets. And, Corey got asked, it's like, and Corey's from Georgia and he talks about that all the time. And he got asked like, don't you guys think it's, do you really think it's a good decision to be giving your business to the state of Georgia right now or whatever? And he kind of, snapped on him, rightfully so. I made a whole video about that a while back about how I didn't buy into that because like Georgia, I think is a really like illustrative example of this because like, just a few weeks prior, Georgia was like the belle of the ball, every liberal's darling state, Georgia. They were the heroes of the left because they swung the tide or whatever. And everybody was all, warm and lovey-dovey about the state of Georgia. You did it, Georgia. And then, you know, the crazy right-wingers who are still there, in response to that, they get some upsetting legislation passed, and then all of a sudden, like literally overnight, complete 180. Fuck Georgia. We can't do, you know, no more for Georgia anymore. You know, no business for Georgia. They don't deserve it. Fucking let's choke them out economically and teach them a lesson or whatever. And it's like, you know, all those people that made Georgia turn blue that you were so thrilled about, like, it's not like they left. Like, they're all still there. Stacey Abrams is still there, you know, like, so what? Just fuck them now? Like, they don't get to go to shows anymore or whatever. Like, they don't get to work. A lot of people in Atlanta work in the film industry, some movie gets moved or something like that. There's like regular people, a lot of whom are probably liberals, who like now don't have a job because of this shit. And they're on our side. Like, what? Absolutely. It just completely fucks those people over for no good reason, you know? And I've also always said about my shows specifically, first of all, no one's going to care. I'm not Bruce Springsteen. But secondly, even if they did care, like, the people that, you know, you're trying to affect by boycotting, like, specifically, they would love it if I kept my ass out of their state. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, that guy's not coming. Oh, it must be my birthday. You know what I mean? Like, me showing up, it would piss them off more than like trying to boycott them. So like, there's a million different reasons why I just am not down with that mentality at all and never have been.
Yeah, it's something that I think, like you pointed out, disregards the people there that are impacted by that. And they're also busting their ass. I mean, you can talk about that with Tennessee and Georgia, like the people that have worked for 10 years to be able to build the infrastructure to flip 2 goddamn Senate seats and a state during the election. It's just, I don't know. It just it drives me insane. And it's one thing that I think living and doing like a lot of political work and grassroots work in Tennessee made me really appreciate, because that state is really complicated. There's a lot of voting restrictions. There's a lot of reasons why Republicans win. Now, it is a very conservative state in many respects, but I think that's something that people fail to realize. They look at an electoral map and they judge it based on whether it's red or blue.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how y'all feel about this, but can I ask you a couple questions about that? Maybe you could teach me some stuff, because I moved 4 years ago, and like, I keep up with what's going on in Tennessee, and I've been mostly discouraged by it. I felt like right before, like in the years before I moved, Haslam was the governor. He's still a Republican, but like there were some okay things that were happening, like the free community college and that type of stuff. Like there were a couple of moments where I was like, yeah, I'm proud to be Tennessee, and Tennessee seems to be moving in the right direction. And in the past few years, it feels like completely the opposite to me. Like, I think Marsha Blackburn's one of just the worst of the worst. Bill Lee's a monster. Horrible. It seems to be moving, and especially when compared to like Georgia turning blue and all that stuff, Tennessee seems to be, I don't know if backsliding is the right word or not, but I'm not liking it. And I'm wondering, you have like firsthand sort of experience with it. Like, if you could just sort of give me your thoughts on that, either one of you guys, like what the reality of that is, and also the prospects for the future, and don't spare my feelings. Just give it to me straight.
I'll premise by saying I moved away from Tennessee about a year ago, but I was there for almost 5 years, worked a lot of grassroots throughout pretty much the whole state from each corner. And you could see a trend. Like, Haslam was a very moderate Republican. Yeah. Like, he was for Medicaid expansion, you know? And I think from what I was told, so I worked with a guy who ran both of Governor Bredesen's gubernatorial campaigns. And then he was deputy governor. And so he knows a lot about like when that shift kind of occurred from blue to red, because Tennessee, as you know, is a very blue state for a long time as far as like electoral politics go. And it seemed like, 2010, certainly, like the Tea Party wave really caught hold there. And you have this old era of Republicans that just has completely fallen out of vogue. The way that he described it was Phil Bredesen and Bob Corker and Lamar Alexander, 2 previous senators, were all kind of within the same area politically, as well as Haslam. That brand of Republican is completely fucking dead.
Right.
and it's because people like Marsha Blackburn are the ones that are taking over the reign of the party, which I'm glad you mentioned her. I have in my my outline here, it just says fuck Marsha Blackburn, so I'm glad that we're getting into that.
Yeah.
But her and Bill Haggerty, who's a robot that you basically plug a chip into his back and tell him what he needs to say and he'll say it. And Bill Lee, the same thing. It is this kind of like, I hate the word Trumpian, but it's sort of a Trumpian brand that's taken hold of the Republican Party, and they've been able to, I think, very successfully start to build that up from the bottom. If you look at the legislature is a supermajority Republican legislature. It's kind of like West Virginia, where we're from. I think it's a lot of things, I guess, to put a button on it. It's the Republican Party in Tennessee as a whole has shifted very much towards like your Trump brand of Republican and away from a Lamar Alexander or like, you know, what he was before, Governor Haslam type brand. And I think it's really latched on and energized a lot of people. And I don't see that going anywhere. Now, what should be counter to that, and I'll stop rambling here after this, is there's a ton of like influx into Nashville of people, young people, more liberal people moving in that you would think that might help, but it just hasn't been enough, I think, to really overcome that. And then with gerrymandering, they were able to get rid of one or two seats the last time, and they actually could, if they wanted to, they could redraw it and get rid of the Democratic seat in Nashville if they really tried hard enough. So I think it's a lot of that, but really it's the Republican Party latching on to that Trump style brand and getting away from that moderate brand. And I think it's energized a lot of them. I'm not an expert on this. There are people that know a lot more than I do, but that's my take from having lived there for however many years.
I mean, that all kind of tracks with what I sort of, you know, thought as well. And like, I remember like Haslam, you know, like I was always a liberal Democrat, but like, you know, I felt like I could live with a Republican like Haslam was, you know,
sure.
And like, it's just such a shame that, like you said, that just basically seems to not exist anymore. And it does seem to me to be because of Donald Trump. I guess the Tea Party first and then Trump, and it's just swung them so far to the extreme, but it's also so effective with their people, which is what makes it discouraging and upsetting, I guess. But yeah, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to what you mentioned earlier about specifically like Georgia, I think that happens all over the South and Appalachia. Like people see something bad happen in one of these southern states or, you know, in one of these Appalachian states, and they immediately want to cancel the entire state. So it begs the question, like I always ask people, like, because people shit on West Virginia all the time. And you know what? A lot of times, you know, rightfully so when it comes to politics and stuff, I get it. But it's obviously, it's normally liberals who are shitting on West Virginia. And then they kind of wonder sometimes why conservatives here don't like liberals. And I don't think it's as much politics as much as it comes off as them hating West Virginia, because I don't know about Tennessee, but in West Virginia, like you could be liberal, conservative, whatever. But if you talk shit on West Virginia, it's like us versus everyone kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, no, that's another thing. It's like, that's absolutely real. Like some liberals like don't want to hear it, even though they're the ones that, you know, continue to propagate it. But that's sort of like mentality of, oh, they hate us and just think we're all a bunch of, you know, dipshit racists or whatever. And they look down on us. So fuck them all. Like that's a very real thing. And like, I have a whole lot of super liberal fans, many of whom are not from the South. They're like coastal liberals or whatever. And I mean, you know, I love them, but it's wild the way that they will talk to me about the South sometimes, you know, and I have to almost like remind them like, hey, I'm from there and I love Tennessee, you know, so like, I'm not really trying to hear all this shit where they just talk about how like insanely racist it is, whatever. I remember this one big Hollywood type of liberal I was talking to once was just, her daughter was going to go to college in Tennessee, but like, well, I'm not going to say which one, but like a nice liberal artsy type of college, you know, and she was like literally scared for like her daughter's safety or whatever. I don't know. Like she thought it would be that dangerous. And I remember just being like, she's going to be fine. I promise you she's going to be fine. I mean, you know, she might have to worry about some frat boy shit, you know what I mean? Like anything that a young woman anywhere has to worry about in college. But the Tennessee part of it is not going to be a problem. I promise you. And she was also like just trying to get me to like explain to her why it was so racist, you know, like so systematically racist, whatever. And I was like, I kind of just snapped on her. I was like, why are you asking me about it when the LAPD is right there? You know,
Jesus,
like
seriously,
like what about that? Like ask Rodney King how much more racist Tennessee is than, you know, like out here. Like NWA wasn't rapping about how appreciated they felt in Southern California. You know what I mean? Like
that'd be a terrible song.
That's the thing that always like gets me. And it's like, I've learned you got to be careful when going on these rants like this, because you could come off as like an apologist or something. And my whole thing has always been like, I'm not saying that the South doesn't have issues with race still, that there aren't racist and racism, systematic racism in the South. Of course there are. I'm just saying that's an American problem. Like that exists everywhere else too. Because what a lot of times those liberals do, whether they even realize it or not, is they use the South as the scapegoat for that shit, which kind of implicitly, you know, tells them in their brain that that means it's not a problem everywhere else. Do you know what I mean? Like they point at the South and be like, there, like that's where the racists are, you know, which means
we know
not here, you know, not here where I am. They're there.
Yep.
And that's just like, that's not true. You know what I mean?
Every time. No, I mean, we say this, I mean, literally, like if Chuck is producing, or when Chuck produces a show, if he ever has time to do it, like you could literally go like tons of episodes where we've said the exact same thing of literally stop blaming just a single part of the country for what is a systematic problem across the nation. I mean, that's the thing, is we give some people passes for doing these bad things and we condemn others. We should condemn everybody if they're doing this terrible shit.
Right. It's like also a point I'm sure y'all have made plenty of times. We kind of alluded to it already, that I've also brought up a ton, is like you look at an electoral map, and traditionally like the South is just a big swath of red, right? But in any given state, the breakdown is like 58-42 or, you know, 55-45 or whatever, red to blue. If you take all those states together, it's just one big chunk of red, but that's millions of people who voted blue, who are on the other side of it, you know, but they just get forgotten about. But the thing is, that works in reverse too. In California, it's blue, but there's 40% of people out here, you know, voted for Trump. 40% of people, or roughly that, whatever it is, in like Marin County or San Francisco or wherever, name your liberal bastion, roughly 40% of people there voted for Donald Trump and are conservative as hell, you know? So it's like, yeah, it's just easy to paint with a very broad brush, and people tend to do that when the reality of it is way, way more complicated. The other thing that I'm sure you all have talked about is me, Corey, and Drew, we've toured the country, driven across a lot of states, and it's like cities are kind of cities, and then the rural parts are kind of, you know, they're not all the same, but you know what I mean? You see, like we drove from Spokane, Washington to Seattle, Washington, right? Seattle's liberal as hell, but that drive across the state of Washington, shitload of Trump flags, shitload of pro-life billboards, gun stores, all the, like, I mean, it looked like rural Alabama, you know what I mean? Not topographically speaking, but like culturally, same place. And pretty much every state is like that. The place outside of the South that we saw the most Confederate flags in was Maine. I don't know why. And it was like, we saw like 4, but we were in Maine for a day and a half. You know, that's a lot of Confederate flags to see in Maine. But I'm just saying, like, the shit exists everywhere on both sides of the spectrum, but it doesn't get talked about or treated that way, you know?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You hit on one thing that was actually one of my favorite pet peeves, and you mentioned California. I did this. I started crunching the numbers one day, and you could kind of cut like the eastern chunk of California out, and you would have the 26th most populous state at like 4.5 million people that voted for Trump by 7.4%. It's like these state boundaries are arbitrary, and it's these generalizations that hurt. I mean, you kind of alluded to this when people make assumptions about where you're from, and it's based on these false assumptions and stereotypes. Some of which, like, there are granular truths to, and I think you're right. Like, when we do get into this type of conversation, you have to be really careful not to sound like an apologist. Right. But it also, you're very right that it is an American problem, not just necessarily a Southern problem.
The other thing about it, when it comes to race in particular, is like, the South is like arguably the most racially diverse region of the whole country. Like the South is where most Black Americans live, other than a few, other big cities, Detroit and New York or whatever. But like the South is very Black. There's a lot of Black people in the South, and a lot of times you have liberals from like some liberal place that's 99% white. You know what I mean? Talking about how racist the South is. And actually, I've told this story a million times. I'm going to tell it again because I just think it was very mind-blowing to me. I had a conversation with a woman who came to my show who was a self-professed liberal white woman in her mid-40s probably. Nice lady, but she was after a show. We were at a bar and she was there. She had been at the show. She had been drinking and she was talking to me. And she had already mentioned in passing that she grew up in some suburb of Colorado. We were in the state of Colorado. She grew up in some suburb of Colorado that she had already told me was like 99% white, right? That's where she was from. Then later, she mentions that she drove through the South once 20 years ago, right? On her way to Miami or whatever, drove through it once 20 years ago. And she just could not believe how incredibly racist the South was. And I'd been drinking too. And so I was like... I was like, okay, you know what? I got to say, that's honestly a long time pet peeve of mine is when someone like you, who is admittedly from a place that's almost entirely white, talks about how racist the South is, because to me, it's like, I mean, what do you even know about racism, right? You live only with white people. And I really, really thought I had fucked up and put my foot in my mouth because she said, well, actually, I do know about it. My daughter is Black, right? So I was like, oh, shit. Okay, Trae, you fucked up this time. But then she kept going, and I swear to God, this is what she said verbatim. She goes, no, I do know a little bit about it because my daughter is Black. I mean, she doesn't act Black. Like, she makes great grades. She loves to read. It's like she doesn't act Black at all. And I was like, what? I said, that's literally the most racist shit I've heard in years, probably. And she was like, no, I'm just saying. I was like, no, I'm just like, that was crazy racist. And I'm saying this is a self-identified liberal woman in Colorado with a mixed race talking about her own mixed race daughter in a super racist way, and had no self-awareness about that whatsoever. Like, if you suggested to her, like, outside of this context, that she might have some issues with race or she's racist or whatever, she would emphatically deny it. You know what I mean? No, never. Fundamentally opposed to any kind of racism or bigotry. But yet this is, what comes out of her brain about her own child. And so it's like, it's just really complicated. Like, the whole thing is just really complicated on both sides. Because on the flip side, we all know, if you're from the South, we all know, like, old people who will use fucking racial slurs and whatever, but otherwise don't do or act racist. Do you know what I mean? Like, they just, like, they don't hate anybody. They genuinely don't. They're just ignorant in the way that they talk or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, or, not just race. I mean, you have, like, some old boy yelling, just being like, I mean, hell, I think queers should get married. You know what I mean? It's like, like, that's like the right, that's like the right ultimate stance to make, but the wrong way to go about it, the wrong way to say it. You know what I mean? It's like, and that's a real thing too. So it's like I'm saying, it's just very complicated at every point along that spectrum,
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, and that also is like, when I think about that, to me, that's also a generational issue across the board.
Yes.
Like, people want to say, like, oh man, down there in Georgia or Tennessee, like, all these older people say this. Older people say it across the board because them growing up, they didn't have this culture that we have. It's a totally different culture. So they still use it in their everyday vocabulary across the country. probably across the world, to be honest, but I don't know much about the other side of the hemisphere, but still.
Yeah, dude, you think like all like Italian mammals in Long Island aren't racist as fuck? Like, I guarantee you they are. Yeah, it is generational. Old people are just,
yeah,
it was a different time, they say,
yeah,
which is true. But yeah.
And it sucks, like, because nobody wants to create excuses for it. But then, you look at the major differences that we have now. I mean, it's just a totally different world. It really is. Even just not even looking at just the racist parts, but just the vocabulary that we're allowed to use versus what they were allowed to use.
Right.
I wanted to jump into and say just real quick about a statistic. In Appalachia, everybody thinks that everybody here is white. Like, that's what we always get all the time. And a lot of times people forget, like, almost 20% of new growth in Appalachia are minorities. And that's actually a pretty decent number when it comes to across the board. It's still low, but everybody says, like, oh, Appalachia's all white, and just dismisses all of these other people.
Yes, that is another thing that has always annoyed me, is it's like other people, when they think of like the South or Southerners, they only mean like one type of person, even though there are so many other different types of Southerners. And those people can like be aware of that, but they like discount the ones who don't fit that, their preconception that they have in their head. Like, even me, it's like, yeah, it's essentially like, yeah, you're from there, but you're not one of them or whatever. And it's always like, why don't I count? Do you know what I mean? Like, I should count in your assessment of what the South is like, but it don't work that way. They just put me into the other category. You know what I mean? And keep thinking that a Southerner is fucking racist, inbred hillbilly or whatever. And it's like, even other like Southerners, like-minded Southerners can tend to do that sometimes. I almost feel bad when I tell this story because he's a really good dude. And I won't say his name, but it's a journalist I had an interview with, a Southern journalist who, again, good dude, progressive. And he like had this realization about himself because he was interviewing me, and he said, who do you think is like the best Southern comedian out there right now? And I said, Roy Wood Jr. And he was like, oh, wow. You know what? Honestly, I didn't even realize this, but like when I said Southern comedian, I just kind of took it for granted that it would be like, a white Southern comedian.
Right.
He's like, even though like I realized that's not fair because Roy's from Alabama, and he's very, very, very Southern in my opinion, and he is also the best. So like, it's a totally valid response, but it's just like it's just a thing people do, classifies certain ways.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's something that I think I know we try to push back on, and I know that you all, well read and also individually, really do a great job at. One thing I wanted to talk about before we let you go, in addition to your tour that's upcoming, which is very exciting, I'm very happy you guys are getting back on the road, and we'll mention that. One thing I did want to talk about, though, is some of the movement by, I think, more progressive people to have more of a voice in places in the South and in Appalachia. One of those is Tennessee Holler, I think run by Justin Canoe. Great guy. Wish he would have won his race, but valiant effort nonetheless. He's put together a really impressive organization. You spoke at Holler Fest. I'm kind of curious, what your thoughts are about that, like the type of work you've been doing with him and with his organization, and how important that is to a place like Tennessee.
I think it's hugely important. I love Justin. I love the Holler. I love what he's doing. And I think that type of thing is hugely important because like people need to be made aware that that the South is not a monolith and there's more than just one type of voice coming from it. I'm not at all calling myself a trailblazer or nothing. But when I first went viral in 2016, there were so many people who said some version of like, oh, you're like a unicorn or something. Or like, I literally didn't know that people like you existed. Like people like coastal people, whatever, would literally say that to me. Like, I didn't know you were a thing. This is great, or whatever. And it's like, yeah. And I'm not the only one either. Like even in Salina, Tennessee, my buddies that I'm still tight with, they're all like me. You know what I mean? And sure, we're like 7 dudes, but in a school of, from a class of 60, that's not that bad.
Sizable percentage.
Yeah, right. And where people just, it was like a totally unknown thing to a lot of the rest of the country, literally, that there were dissenting opinions in the South. Like they didn't know that there were any liberals in the South at all. And now, X number of years later, I feel like there's a lot of people and a lot of voices and platforms like the Tennessee Holler out there that, you know, prove otherwise. And they've gotten more and more popular and people see their stuff. And so surely we can just slowly continue to chisel away at that perception, you know, and it's because of people like Justin in places like the Holler and you guys too, and just everybody that's trying to, you know, fight the good fight and whatnot. So yeah, I definitely think it's important because that's like, I think people a lot of times, especially people on the coast, don't realize that that's actually probably the more important part of it all to me. Meaning, like, people ask me a lot, how many minds have you changed, right? And what they mean is like a stereotypical redneck who's like cool with abortion now because of a YouTube video or whatever. And I'm always like, I'm gonna be honest with you, not that many. Anecdotally, yeah, I have heard a couple of stories. People at shows been like, my dad saw your video and now whatever. That has happened, but not often. I think that's very hard to do, right? But what has happened a lot is I have talked to coastal people or people from outside the South who have told me, you know, you kind of changed the way that I viewed the South in general. And that's actually more important to me, you know, because that's like more achievable. So that's like, insofar as I have a mission, which I don't, I'm a comedian, I want to be funny. But if I had a mission, that's what it is trying to just show a different side of the South, you know? And that's what the Holler and Justin and you guys and everybody else is, you know, the rest of us like-minded country folks are trying to do. So yeah, I'm all for it.
Hell yeah. Yeah, you make a good point. And I think changing the perception of the South and Appalachia is something that's extremely important. And I think those organizations like T and Holler, that type of thing, builds community because it shows people, even other Tennesseans that may feel that way but don't feel like they have an outlet or don't feel like there's a voice speaking for them or with them. I think it's a really important thing because that's I think how a lot of the right-wing bullshit has really gotten so strong is because there has been strong communities built around that, Tea Party being just one example of it.
Yeah.
Well, I know that you've got another interview to go to, so I want to give you some time in between that. But I did want to make sure that we plugged the Well Read comedy tour that's coming up because I saw you and Corey, I think, put something out about tour dates now, and it looks like you're booking more by the day, which is extremely exciting. I was very disappointed when they got canceled because I was actually supposed to see y'all in DC in April 2020. Jesus, it's almost been 2 years now.
Yeah,
but well, actually, it's a year. I don't know. I can't count.
It's a year, but it feels like an eternity. But yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway. No, we're thrilled. We were thrilled to be finally, because like what happened was they first got, you know, the pandemic first happened, and it seems so ridiculous now, but this is how most people felt. When it first happened, we had some shows and they just got like pushed back. And it was like, we got something about, you know, late July, early August. This is in shows in March or April. And at that time we were like, oh yeah, we'll be fine, you know, by August, right? and then you got pushed back. Some of them got pushed back to like December, and we were like, surely by the end of the year it'll be fine, you know. And that just didn't happen. And here we are. It's actually, we had taken a 2-month break that was planned for like a year and a half in advance, and it just so happened to be January and February of 2020, right? Our first like break from the road in 4 years, and it was that time frame. So we haven't had the Well Read Comedy Tour hasn't had a show in 18 months since December 2019.
Oh,
so we are thrilled to get back to it. And yeah, it's Well Read, and that's RED, wellreadcomedy.com, and has all the current dates. Some of the ticket links aren't up yet because this is all coming together pretty quickly, and it's very legit, you know, kind of a logistical nightmare trying to get this all back up and running. But we are adding new dates all the time. We're getting the links up and everything. But July 10th in Atlanta, July 23rd, 24th in Birmingham, Alabama. Those dates are up and the tickets are available now. So yeah, please check it out. Come see us.
Hell yeah, for sure. And we'll put links in our episode to that too as well, because I know a lot of our fans are really excited about that. They have been wanting you to come on our show, so we're really, really grateful for your time and
For sure.
really appreciate it. And hopefully we can talk again in the future. I'd love to have you on again or work on something in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to it. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.